Well, hey everyone, Nona Jones here, and I am truly honored and excited to have this next conversation. I was recently reading a book called White Too Long by a gentleman named Robert P. Jones. He is a social scientist, a statistician. He also grew up in the Southern Baptist Convention. He has been classically trained in seminary, and he was exploring the very intricate history of Christianity and our understanding of what it means to be white and Christian. And there was a story that he shared in the book about a church in Macon, Georgia, that had a split. It had a split along racial lines. However, many years later, there were two pastors who were pastoring the two churches, predominantly white congregation, predominantly Black congregation, that had a shared history, that they had been able to do some very difficult work to confront that history in order to shape a new future. And I believe that what they have done, the work they have done, the example that they have created is instructive for all of us. And so I'm excited today to get to introduce to you Pastor Scott Dickison. He leads the First Baptist Church of Christ in Macon, as well as Pastor James Goolsby, who leads the First Baptist Church, also located in Macon. They have a very interesting shared history. And we're going to talk about not just the history, but the lessons they have learned as they have pursued conciliation of that history. So to kick things off, for people who are not very familiar with this story, I would actually love if you could give them just a quick overview. We'll start with you, Scott, if you would. Who founded the Baptist Church in Macon, and how did it sustain its existence in hard times?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting us here today, and excited to have another opportunity to talk about our relationship with the First Baptist Church and the journey we've been on over these last 5 or 6 years. So the Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, was founded in 1826 by maybe 5 or 6 founding families, all of whom were white, and many of whom were slave owners. Over the next 20 years, that congregation grew as Macon grew. Macon was still very much the frontier in that part of the 19th century. And as it grew, the Black members of the congregation eventually started to outnumber the white members. Many of the Black members were enslaved by the white members, though not all. And in 1845, the congregation made a decision, or a decision was made within the congregation to begin worshiping separately, where the Black members would be able to worship on their own. So a new meeting house was constructed, and the churches remained, I guess, technically under one pastor, the white pastor. There was a Black preacher for the Black members, and I guess we can get into later kind of how we've told that story differently in our two current congregations, but essentially in those times it was against the law for Black people to congregate without the supervision of whites. And so the white pastor in that time really functioned as the overseer for the Black congregation. The white pastor did. So in 1845, the congregation started worshiping separately, and that was the arrangement until 1845 until 1865, after the end of the Civil War, when a formal split was made. And at that point, the white church took on a whites-only membership policy, which lasted for the next 100 years until 1965. But over the next 150 years or so, our two congregations kept the same name. So our congregation, the First Baptist Church of Christ, which was kind of the original name of the church after was originally the Baptist Church, and then the First Baptist Church of Christ. And the congregation that James pastors now is the First Baptist Church. And it kind of speaks to the divisions ingrained in a society where you could have two churches with virtually the same name that worship literally around the corner from each other for that long. And, no one seems to see anything, wrong with that, or anything confusing. So we did. Our two churches kind of sat there and ministered and, worshiped in their respective houses for 150 years on the same street corner. Had a little bit, there was a pulpit swap or two maybe in the 1970s. I think they gathered for worship around the year 2000, 2001. But it was in 2014 into 2015 that James and I struck up a relationship and really felt the call of the Spirit to lead our congregations into greater cooperation. And we covenanted together to do that, explore our history, to share our history and who we are today, and share ministry and confront all of these things that I think in many ways our churches have been these wounds of our country that our churches have really been the bearers of.
Yeah, I think this idea of wounds is an important one. And what I have found is something so peculiar. When you, as a human being, are wounded or hurt, you don't typically ignore the pain, right? Like you typically will inspect it, try to figure out what the source is so that you can stop the pain. And yet somehow, when it comes to issues of race, we've decided to just try to ignore it. James, I'd love for you to weigh in on this, because what I have found is that there has been this call to move forward. Let's move forward. Let's just be united. Let's just get over it, without first understanding how we even got to where we are today. Can you tell us how your church came to be in the history of the First Baptist Church?
And again, Scott related to the fact that the story changes based on who's telling the story. And I'm the 27th pastor of First Baptist Church on New Street. And I often say they had more pastors than Israel had kings in a shorter period of time. And there have been some legendary pastors who preceded me, and one of them being Julius Caesar Hope, who was the one that had that pulpit swap in the 70s. And that was, it was radical even at that time, because that wasn't taking place. The fact that he preached in the white church. And so coming behind them, that rich history of pastors who were before me, the opportunity that we got to learn the history of our church started with a book that was written by one of the members of First Baptist Church of Christ, which brought some clarity in terms of our history. We had, and they had an understanding of our start date literally being 1845. Now, as Scott mentioned, that's not when the church started. It started 1826. And subsequently, once we started this relationship between the two churches and started looking at the history and started looking at documents, we made a decision to change our start date to the original start date, 1826. And so that was huge, and it was very well received by the membership, only because of the conversations we had. And we'll talk about that in a little while. But that history, we began to look at our churches, though separated, had a very common history. We had a lot of people working literally almost side by side in the universities, in the hospitals. Our church was a church that was considered in the African-American community as the mother church. It's second oldest continuing Black Baptist church in the Southeast to First African that's in Savannah. And so, it's Dr. Walter Glover, who pastors Greater Zion Hill Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, is also a long-term moderator of the Union Baptist Association, refers to our church as the mother church. He says pretty much most of the Baptist churches can trace their roots to coming out of First Baptist Church on New Street, and that's the church that we pastor. So we have that history of people working similar jobs, people in education. At one time in the 60s, the thought was if you wanted a job in education and you were Black, you needed to be familiar with, visit, or talk to members of First Baptist Church because they were engaged in those leadership positions in the Black community, both in jobs, both in the medical field, both in education. And so it had that reputation. When I came along as pastor, I had to kind of share with the membership some portions of it that we're no longer that church. Every church has members who are educators, who are politicians, who are doctors, and so forth. So don't think too highly of yourself, and that allowed that personality shift to change and be more receptive to whatever God leads us to do. So that history, kind of in a nutshell, we've been basically on the same track, those separate churches, even since the separation.
Wow. This is so rich. I wanna ask a question, Scott. I'm gonna come to you because I think a lot of times I've certainly noticed as the founder of Faith and Prejudice and engaging in conversations about injustice, people want to rush over injustice, like they want to rush over it and let's get to the healing. But I think it's so important to confront it. I believe in my heart that there's a difference between being adjacent to something and being proximate. So adjacency is I know that it happened and I get it, but to be proximate is to actually inspect it and handle it. And so what you've done is, I think, become proximate to it. I say that because I know there was a situation that happened in the Baptist Church where I think I read that it came on some hard times financially, and made a decision that I think would strike many today as being very unjust. But I think when you have blinders on, you don't think about it. Could you maybe share what that is? And also, when your members found out about this, how they maybe responded to the knowledge of what was done to members of the church?
Sure. Well, a big part of our story over the last 5 or 6 years, as we've come into relationship with First Baptist Church, it's really been twofold. We've had this relationship with First Baptist and the conversations we've had with them, which have been rich and so generous on their part. But I've also understood that a big part of this for us is to do our own work and to have the conversations that we just need to have internally, that we can't, rely on our Black brothers and sisters to kind of, baby step us through. So a lot of what we've done is, relook at our history. And some of that we did with First Baptist. Other parts we've done internally. We're really blessed to have, as James noted about his church, we too are a church that has a lot of highly educated members, a great relationship with Mercer University, and are blessed with professors and academics and all these folks. And we happen to have a member named Dr. Doug Thompson, who is a professor of Southern history at Mercer University here in Macon. And so Doug and I, a few years ago, started doing some work to examine more about that early history. Who were our founders? What were they about? What were they doing? And that's really when we found out that, so many of those founding families owned slaves. We also learned that, as I said before, this was the frontier back in those times. And so we had some scoundrels, this part of this church. They were in the newspapers all the time, suing each other, suing other people, speculating land, all of these different things. But we were also the church that had many leaders. And early on, we lost a building to debt because of we were too wrapped up in the finances of one of our early members, but recovered and eventually built a sanctuary in the 1850s that was known as the jewel of the city of downtown. So we've always, really, we've looked at that building. We haven't been in that building since the 1880s. It burned down. But as we started looking back into that time in our church's history and how that building project, which would have been very big, how it would have been financed, we found some really curious information, really tracing some of our very influential members to their finances being just completely wrapped up in the slave trade, which is something that I think we all know intellectually that when we're talking about the slave economy in the South and really the country at that time, we're really just talking about the economy. It was so intertwined. There was not a point along the way that, where money was not involved in some way in the institution of slavery. But all the same, to see that kind of, played out with actual people's names and actual dollar amounts, it was shocking. So we found a couple of these influential families, that made, very large gifts to the church around that time to fund this building. And, given what we know about finances of that time, it seems entirely likely that that building project for our sanctuary was either financed by the sale of enslaved people, or perhaps was mortgaged through assets of enslaved people. And when we know what we know about the membership of our church at that time, these enslaved people would have been members of the church. And so we're talking about a church sanctuary that's being built through either the sale or the mortgaging of its own members. And so, I shared that with our congregation, these findings that we had. And in some of these cases, we were able to track down the receipts, of the sale of such and such enslaved person. I remember there was 2 teenage boys, and we saw the dollar amounts right next to their names and how that money was then sent to the church for the pastor's fund or what have you. And to kind of see it laid out there in that way, again, as much as we know these things intellectually, it was shocking and it was gutting. And when I shared all of this with our congregation in a sermon, there were audible gasps as we were kind of laid, that history was laid in front of us, I think, so directly. Often in churches, we talk about the inheritance that we've received from those who came before. A historic church like ours will often talk about, the saints that sat in those pews, and how we sit in pews that we didn't build ourselves. And I think that's good. And I think we are a people of memory, and we celebrate that. I mean, our central mystery of the Lord's Supper, we remember these things. But I think the truth of it is that if we're going to claim all of these blessings that we've inherited and the positive elements of our history, if we are truly a people of memory, then we need to remember all of it, and we need to claim all that we've inherited. And that knowledge and that opening of our understanding of our own history for a church that has prided itself on its history has been, I think, nothing short of transformational. But we also know through the gospel message that transformation does not come easy, and that it's a process, and that it's costly. And so that's been a part of our story as well.
If I may, Nona, one of the things that kind of drew us into this relationship was the willingness to address history, not through rose-tinted glasses, but to really address the history. One of the other things that Doug brought up in his sharing that history was the timing of the separation and how that was also associated with indoor plumbing. It sounds simple enough, but when you think about the possibility of sharing that water, sharing the baptismal pool, those things all contributed to the desire to separate. And so, just Scott and his members' willingness to not just jump into something, but let's have some accountability. Let's get some realistic assessment of where we've been before we can determine where we're going. And that's been helpful.
Wow. As I listen to this, it strikes me that, so much of what we see today is directly related to the pain of our past. And if we don't acknowledge it, we will just assign meaning to what is that is wrong. So for example, many people will cite how, there are so many, single mothers in the Black community, and that, families are fractured. But then you go back in this history and you realize, well, there has been a time where people were sold to economically benefit a church, and they were ripped from their families. People would never see their mothers or their fathers or their sons or their daughters ever again. And I think about my own self, and I'm like, we've been doing some historical research on our family, because there's a certain point at which we don't have any records of our ancestors because they were sold and they were given away. And so all of this matters. What is always an outgrowth of what was. Speaking of that, James, I'd love it if you can share, as you were being approached by First Baptist Church of Christ about there was a fellowship trip that they wanted to take. And I know you and your congregation were a bit reluctant about that. I'd love if you could just share that story to give people a sense of the psychology that you were having to deal with.
Right. We've done a number of things since then, but that initial one was the timing of it and the location. Scott's church traditionally, I don't know how many, every so often they will bring in the new year with their youth at Disney World. And one of the things that they invited us after we began this relationship was for our youth to go on that trip with them. And my immediate thought was, no, that's not going to happen. This was in Disney World, which of course is in Florida. And this was around the time of the Trayvon Martin killing. And my son at the time was 15 years old, and you put a hoodie on his head and he looked just like Trayvon Martin. And I made the commitment, especially once Florida passed those stand your ground laws, that I was not going back to Florida. They were not going to get $1 of mine to pour into that state. And definitely my son wasn't going without me. So it was not something that was I was even considering at the time. And one of Scott's members, David Cook, who I didn't know at the time, didn't know his position within the community, began to press upon me, Pastor, if you let him go, I'll look after him like he's my own son. I'll make sure that he's safe. And at the time, he said, I know the DA in that area, and I'll make sure that we're covered. I said, at the time, I wasn't concerned. At the time, I wasn't concerned about the police. Now, of course, that's changed now. But at the time, I wasn't. And so I was more concerned about the average citizen that thought they had a right to confront anybody that looked like me and my son. And so I was still hesitant, but I was prayerful about it. And I said, okay, I will allow this after much prayer. And at that point, other members of our ministry began to allow their children to go, and some of the adults went as well. It was only later that I found out that David was, at the time, the district attorney for Bibb County. And so we always kid about that now, that, I'm like, who are you? But he convinced me that my son would be safe. And it turned out to be a great trip. And that was one of the first trips we did. Like I said, we've done, I think, some even more meaningful ones since then that had a profound effect on both congregations. And but that was, it was like the timing of it was like, no, it's not going to happen. But it turned out to be a good thing.
I'm taking away, even thus far, there's so many nuggets of wisdom and truth that you both are sharing. One of which is conciliation requires the willingness to wade into the uncomfortable waters of truth. Mm-hmm. Truth is never comfortable. And when you put it in even a theological context, the idea that, because of, Adam's sin, that now I am, someone who needs salvation, even though I may not have, in my own mind sinned. It's the recognition that there is a debt that has to be recognized. That's one thing. The second thing that I'm taking from this is what you just said, James, is so powerful, is that David, he essentially took accountability for your son's safety, recognizing that he was not the one who would be considered a threat. He was not the one who was at risk. He took responsibility for your son's safety. And so part of conciliation is taking responsibility for another person's risk. And I think given that, I'd love for you both to share, what does your work look like today? What are you working on together, as well as why you feel the long-term commitment is needed over that short-term event or program? Scott, I'd love to start with you, and then I'd love to hear from you, James.
Sure. Well, I think that's something that we've certainly learned over these last few years is, and we said this from the beginning, that we weren't just looking for, a moment. We really were looking for a long-term commitment to each other as congregations, to a covenant together. And looking back over these 5 or 6 years, I'm so grateful that we've been able to keep that before us. And that gives me a lot of hope moving forward, because this is long-term work. When we think about, there's a lot made of the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans to come to this continent in 1619. When we think about the length of time, with not just the enslavement of Africans, but going into, Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and into the models of the civil rights movement, and into mass incarceration and so forth. That's 400 years, and to think that we're going to solve this in any way, with a few pulpit swaps, or even a few conversations around a table, is pretty naive. So I think we've got to understand what we're up against, and just kind of, gird ourselves for the long haul. We can do this. This is, it's hard, but of course it's hard. I would say, for what we're doing right now, of course, COVID has shifted everything as for all of us, and in ways that need not be explored. But our congregations over the last year and a half have stayed in touch. Members reaching out to each other. We have a shared Facebook group that folks will just kind of chime in occasionally and just say, thinking and praying for you in the two congregations. James and I have kept up, our conversations. We're just sharing the other day, we're both vaccinated now, so we can get back to our lunch dates that we enjoyed before. But, we've also, there have been, I'll say a couple of things that we've done together, or that, that have to do with our relationship. One was after the George Floyd murder last year. Like so many people around our country, our congregation was deeply hurt, deeply felt that whole reckoning that we went through just really about a year ago now. We felt that deeply, and wanted to respond in some way, wanted to reach out to our brothers and sisters at First Baptist. And so our church leadership crafted a letter in which we were also coming, it was the 5-year anniversary of the signing of our covenant, which is on Pentecost Sunday, and it was around Pentecost Sunday. So it was a way for us to acknowledge that 5 years and recommit ourselves, and let them know that we are still in this all the way. And that we said the names of all those who've been killed in recent weeks and months, and said that we were committed to the work before us, and sent that off to James with fear and trembling, because the last thing that anyone needs is, a kind of a letter sent without any kind of weight behind it. But we hope that it communicated that we're grateful for where we've been, and we're in this for what's ahead of us. And that was received. I'll let James say a little bit about that maybe later. But I think the big thing for us is we've taken this opportunity to continue learning as internally as a congregation, continue reading. We've done a number of book studies in different ways, kind of all church, but also on the like the small group level with, parents and things, talking about, how we teach our children about these weighty matters. And we've also formed a council here at our church to lead us in this racial justice work, both to be our liaisons to First Baptist, but also to guide us in our internal work. And we're excited to have that group meet with a similar group from James's church very soon, kind of once we're able to all meet together again. So it's been, these ways of reaching out when we could, but also taking, I think we did a lot of internal soul searching as a country, as individuals last year. And we really took that to heart and the opportunities before us to continue that inner work and dialogue as a congregation.
One of the things that we were intentional about, Scott and I both were trying not to take ownership. We wanted this to be membership led and to be able to go beyond Scott as pastor and me as pastor. I've been in the Baptist Church. I was baptized when I was 4 years old, so that'll give you an idea. And I've served in so many capacities as a deacon, as associate and assistant pastor, and of course, finally as senior pastor. And I've been at First Baptist for 17 years. And I understand and I see sometimes when it's pastor-led, when the pastor leaves, then that relationship dries up. And so Scott mentioned the fact that we have those groups that we're wanting to take leadership, to take charge, so that when we're off the scene, the work will continue. Scott's a young pastor, he's looking for where to go in ministry. I told him,
these last years have aged me, James.
I'm looking for my exit. So we want to make sure that things are where they need to be, where this work will outlive us. Otherwise, it's really, we haven't been good stewards over the work. And so we don't want to take it. And and the way we've been able to do that is both Scott and I have been Holy Spirit led, rather than leaning onto our own understanding. And that has helped us make some great decisions at some perfect times. And I mentioned before, maybe not today, that we had an opportunity early in this relationship to have some great coverage by CBS for what we were doing. And they wanted to come to those first conversations. We had 3 conversations with the church, between the churches, with the churches. And they wanted to come to that first conversation. And we told them, no, you can't come. At the risk of them not giving us the coverage we had hoped this work would get. But we understood that in order for our congregations to really begin to establish that relationship, it had to be without the press, without the outside stuff. And that turned out to be a great decision. And they came back later and still did the piece. So that was making those kind of decisions where we get out of the way and allow the Lord to guide us in what we are doing. So again, the whole idea of getting the members to take ownership in this work, I think will carry it much further than we could possibly think about. One of the things we did before the pandemic, I think was the last major venture we did together, was when we went to Montgomery and spent that time Equal Justice Initiative, and also Scott, what's the name of that? It slips me.
Yeah, the museum there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Truth and the Lynching Museum as well. I don't have the official name for it, but we went as a group of about 20 so of us on one bus together. The 2 churches mixed, and we met that night before we went in the fellowship hall of the church I pastored, and had a conversation about what we were getting ready to do, and then to go there and have that experience again. With me, it was different because now I've got this young man who at the time was a freshman at Morehouse, and so his whole concept of things were different than the 15-year-old when we went to Florida, and to see the reaction he had there, and also to see in that area in the lynching museum, to see my name, Goolsby's, that were in the counties that I know relatives of mine were. And we subsequently we took pictures and came back. And one of my cousins has already made some connections to those being actually family members. And so that experience we shared together was amazing. And so I anticipate us doing even greater work. And I'll share this last thing. During the pandemic, this is one that totally caught me off guard. Let's put it like this. I was able to preach for Scott at the Founders Day before the pandemic. And I sat there and getting ready to preach, and he handed out the monthly bulletin. And so I'm sitting there getting ready to preach, and I'm looking at the monthly bulletin. And for the month, I'm looking at my year's budget. I'll let that sink in for a minute. For the month, I'm looking at my year's budget. And so I'm like, wow, okay. And so, Scott has a little more wherewithal in terms of memberships, finances than we have at First Baptist on New Street. But during the pandemic, I get a check. Well, my secretary calls me, treasurer calls me and said, Pastor, we got a check that we think should be going to First Baptist Church of Christ. And it was a check, very large amount. And so I called I had told her, give me the number of the member. I'll call him, make sure we get this back to Scott. And I called the member. He said he was getting ready to make his tithe, and the Holy Spirit, he filled it out and put our church there, and he was getting ready to correct it, and the Holy Spirit told him, send the check. And he sent the check. And he said, and if you need anything else, let me know. And I called Scott and shared with Scott the blessing of that member. And even that is a result of this relationship. And just so you know, Scott, I didn't call him back. We didn't need him, but we thank God for that offering that was sent as part of his tithes. Those things would never have happened had we not began the relationship. And I'm not looking at the financial part. I'm just saying that, when you're willing to allow God to move, you never know which way he's going to. And that was a blessing for us.
Wow, that's rich. I've often said, I realize that there are so many, predominantly white churches that have a heart, for example, for what they call, urban ministry, which essentially is, going into predominantly Black communities and establishing a church there. And what I've said to them is, I said, instead of doing that, why not invest in the churches that are already there? That already have the relationships and that are already doing the work. And so that just drives this idea of conciliation home. I think for my last question, just in the last few minutes we have, I'd love for each of you to just speak to anyone who's watching this, who is saying, I hear what you're saying, but that's just too hard. What would you say to encourage them to understand that, yeah, it is hard, but it's worth it? Let's start with you, Scott, and then I'd love for you to close us out, James.
Yeah. Well, as I said, a minute ago, this is hard work, and there's no getting around that. It's costly work, I think, when we do it well, and we do it right and truthfully and honestly. But for me, I think in reframing it, is what is the cost of not doing this work? Because for me, for us in the white church in America, reckoning with our racial, not just our racial past, but our racial present, is really, this is our work right now. This is the work of the church. It's not part of the work of the church. I think this is the work of the church, to wrestle with our original sin of racism, as it's been called. This is the closest opportunity, I think the richest opportunity that the white church has to experience the fullness of the gospel. And I think what gives me a lot of hope in that, is that I think that the church, as being the bearer of so many of our country's racial wounds, I think that leaves us uniquely positioned to address them and to heal them. We have the language available to us. We have language of confession and repentance. And we know through the story of our faith that transformation, that salvation can't come without those things, that's a part of it. And so that's what I would say is, yes, it's hard, but this is the work to which we are called. It's not part of the work, it is the work. James mentioned a second ago, that we went to Montgomery and experienced the National Memorial for Peace, and is it National Memorial for
Justice?
Peace
and Justice.
And we met the night before in their fellowship hall and went around the table, and we shared our hopes and fears for what we would experience the next day. And I'll never forget one of our members, in ways that he later admitted, surprised himself at kind of how vulnerable he was able to be in that moment. He said, after a moment or two of silence, "My hope and my fear are the same, which is that I'll feel responsible." And I think that's such an honest place to be. And I think that cuts so close to the heart of this matter, with the need for confession, the need for repentance, but also what our faith teaches us is on the other side of those things. And so for me, this is the gospel. And this is the clearest way, I think, that those of us who are white Christians have to experience the fullness of that gospel.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. From my perspective, allow God to work, because you never know which course he would take. I was invited to a lunch, and I had seen Scott. I think we had been at some function in the church where in the city where something was dedicated, and we both were there. I had not officially met him. I was invited to lunch. I think it was Frank Broom from New Baptist Covenant, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me on that, Scott, and James Bumpus, a pastor there in Macon. James Bumpus is Morehouse grad alumnus. And so he invited me to lunch, and we sat down and we talked. And that's when Scott and I had our first real conversation. And I had no idea where we would go from there. They invited us to, I got something in the mail concerning, email concerning a conference in Atlanta for New Baptist Covenant. And they invited us to come. And before I even communicated with Scott, I had already confirmed that I was going to be there, and that we would be there together. And that started the process. Had no idea where it was going. Be open to the move of God, and get your ego out of the way. Allow God to do the work. Scott has proven himself to be genuine, to be real, and that has helped to make this work. I've not seen his ego get in the way at all, and that's been good. And we've been able to thrive in the relationship because of that. I'll never forget this. When the shooting took place at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, and Scott called me that night. I was literally sitting in the parking lot waiting for my wife, who had run into JCPenney, and I'm in the parking lot trying to wrap my head around everything. And Scott called out of concern, out of what can they do, what can he share with his membership the next day. And the Holy Spirit told me, Scott, we're already doing it. Let's just keep where we are and keep doing the work that is not getting, it's not splattered across the news. People aren't really catching on to what we're doing, but let's keep doing the work. And we've been able to just keep our head down and hunker down and keep doing the work. And I anticipate that to keep going forward. So it's a hard work. For me, it's not been hard in the sense of it's bigger than me. is bigger than us. And if you profess to be called to this work, then at some point you got to get out of the way and let God handle the work. So,
man, this is so rich and inspiring for me. My heart just feels so warm at the words that you said. I think the takeaway for all of us watching this, to use your phrase, Scott, which I think was so appropriate, is, this is not part of the work. This is the work. And then James, what you just said, basically just double clicks into that, which is keep doing the work. That's our takeaway. In order to repair what has been broken, we have to realize that is our job, and we have to keep at it. So I just thank God for both of you. I thank you for your leadership, for your example. I pray that God will continue to do his work through your congregations, because I believe that we are not waiting on Congress to change things. We are waiting on the church to change things. So God bless you both. Thank you for being with us. And thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.